Look at the events you've written down. Is it real to you that the conclusion you reached, nothing I do is good enough, is a valid interpretation of those events? Can you agree that virtually any child at that age and in those situations would have reached a similar conclusion? Now we're going to play the possibilities game. We'll imagine that 4 friends of yours are visiting you and looking at a videotape of the events you just wrote down. Your interpretation of those events when you were a child was, nothing I do is good enough. That is one valid interpretation of Mom and Dad's behavior. That interpretation wasn't wrong, but there are other reasonable interpretations of the same childhood events that you just didn't think of as a child. So let's ask each of your friends for another alternative interpretation. Can you see that one friend might well say, Mom and Dad thought nothing you did was good enough, but they were just plain wrong? Couldn't Mom and Dad thought nothing you did was good enough but were just plain wrong explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation that nothing I do is good enough? Here's what your second friend says. Mom and Dad were mad or annoyed because you didn't do what they wanted you to do, or because you didn't do it the way they wanted, not because nothing you did was good enough. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation that nothing I do is good enough? Here's a third possible interpretation of your childhood events that one of your friends suggests. How about this? Maybe nothing you did as a kid was good enough, but that doesn't mean it will never be. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation that nothing I do is good enough? Your childhood interactions with your parents could have lots of meanings. Here's one your fourth friend suggests. Mom and Dad's annoyance wasn't because nothing you did was good enough. They just had unrealistic expectations for a child your age. Children aren't born knowing that milk gets sour when you leave it out, yet many parents yell the first time their children leave it out. Have you ever met a 4 or 5-year-old child who was on his way to his room to play with his Lego blocks, who was thinking, gee, I'd better make sure there are no toys on the floor so no one trips? I don't think so. And yet many parents yell at their children for not thinking in a way that literally is impossible for young children. Couldn't any one of these interpretations explain your childhood interactions with your parents just as well as your interpretation, nothing I do is good enough? Of course they can. So is it real to you that a belief you've lived with almost your entire life, something you thought was a fact, is not a fact, isn't the truth at all? It's only a truth, merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier events. Right? Please continue to interact totally with this program in order for it to work. And that includes answering my questions out loud, even if your answer is only yes or no. So let me repeat the question. Do you accept that nothing I do is good enough is not a fact, is not the truth, but just a truth, merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier childhood events? I'll bet you do now. With a little help from me and your friends, you can see that the earlier events associated with your parents' annoyance, when you didn't do what they wanted, when they wanted, could have at least 4 different reasonable interpretations or meanings. Do you remember what you wrote down a few minutes ago as the source of your belief, nothing I do is good enough? Look at the text box below on your screen. Right now, imagine seeing what you saw then and hearing what you heard then. Really, take a few minutes and imagine the events of your childhood that led you to the formation of the belief nothing I do is good enough. Didn't it seem when you were a child as if you could actually see nothing I do is good enough in those early events with your parents? It did, didn't it? You may have the sense that you didn't see the belief, you felt it. Once you formed the belief nothing I do is good enough, you probably did feel it. I'll get back to the feeling in a minute. But what I'd like you to focus on now is not the feeling, but on my question, didn't it seem as if you could see nothing I do is good enough? As if it was a fact you observed in the world? I didn't hear you. Did you say yes? Remember what I explained when you were eliminating the earlier beliefs? What happened was that you looked at events that could have had many different meanings and chose one, which in this case was nothing I do is good enough. By attributing that specific meaning to the events, each time you saw Mom and Dad's behavior, it was as if you could see that meaning in their behavior. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events, you attributed the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you gave them one. Now that you think you saw nothing I do is good enough as a child, I'd like you to look again. Did you really see nothing I do is good enough? If you did, what does nothing I do is good enough look like? Can you really point to it? Is there a color, shape, location? Even if your parents said those very words to you, there are as many interpretations of your parents saying something as there is of their behavior. You can't see that anything they say is necessarily true, or even that they believed it. Is it real to you now that you saw events, but never really did see nothing I do is good enough? If anything you can really see can be described, and if you can't describe what nothing I do is good enough looks like, is it clear now that you never really saw it? Since you never really saw nothing I do is good enough, what did you actually see? Is it clear now all you really saw was the reaction of one or both of your parents when you did something? In other words, all you really saw was a series of events? You see, what happened was that you looked at a series of events which can be interpreted in many different ways. You gave the events one meaning, which was nothing I do is good enough. By attributing that specific meaning to the events, each time you saw Mom and Dad's behavior, it was as if you could see that meaning in their behavior. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events, you attributed the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you gave them one. I'm going to make an important distinction here between consequences and meaning. There clearly were consequences to your parents' behavior. You got yelled at or punished, or your parents didn't talk to you. But was there any meaning to their behavior? Let me explain what I mean by meaning. Imagine you're in a room and someone you know comes in and doesn't speak to you. What might you automatically think? Now, for example, you might have just said, they're mad at me, or they're being rude, or maybe they had something on their mind and didn't notice. Notice, however, that what you just said is the meaning you gave to the event. And where did the meaning you just gave their behavior come from? That's right, your mind. Meaning is in your mind. Yes? So if meaning is in your mind, is there any meaning inherent in your parents' behavior? Or in any other events for that matter? Of course the answer is no. So it's not that what happened to you as a child didn't matter, it just has no meaning. Is it real now that the events had no meaning until you attributed one to them? Here's another way to understand that events have no inherent meaning. When I say that, I'm saying you don't know anything for sure about you, about other people, or about life as a result of these experiences. What do I know for sure about you from knowing about how your parents treated you when you were a child? Is it clear that I wouldn't know anything? And if I don't know anything, you don't either. All you know for sure is what actually happened. Your mom and dad sounded annoyed or angry, and perhaps punished you when you didn't do what they wanted you to do when they wanted you to do it. And finally, if you never saw nothing I do is good enough out there in the world, where has it been all these years? Did I hear you say that nothing I do is good enough has only existed in your mind? That you never did see it out there in the world? That's right. Now, if the belief is more real to you as a feeling than as a concept, here's another way to look at it. Didn't it seem as if your parents' behavior and comments when you were a child made you feel nothing I do is good enough? It did, didn't it? I'd like to suggest, however, that their behavior and comments couldn't have made you feel nothing I do is good enough, because as you just acknowledged, the events had no meaning, and meaningless events can't make you feel anything. So if Mom and Dad's behavior couldn't have made you feel nothing I do is good enough, what did make you feel that? By now I think you know the answer to that question. Please answer out loud. That's right. You felt that only because that's the meaning you had already given to your parents' behavior. Let me help you make this real. Imagine that I had been there when you were a little child and had shown you the alternative interpretations for your parents' behavior. And after that conversation you concluded, my parents are having unreasonable expectations of me. Their annoyance has nothing to do with whether what I do is good enough or not. So now here's what I'd like you to do. Take a moment and really imagine being a child, and Mom and Dad get annoyed at you again for something you did or didn't do. As you imagine the events, apply this different interpretation to their behavior. Notice how it feels to be a child who's thinking, my parents have unreasonable expectations of me. That's why they get annoyed, not because nothing I do is good enough. You can use the pause button below to pause the video while you make this childhood scenario more real for yourself. When you're done imagining, press the play button. As you imagine this scene, does it still feel like your parents' words and actions are making you feel nothing I do is good enough? Probably not. And if you didn't feel nothing I do is good enough then, would you feel it now? Again, the answer is no. So Mom and Dad's behavior never caused you to feel nothing I do is good enough. That feeling came from your interpretation of their behavior. And since your feelings were not caused by events in reality, they're only the result of a meaning you made up to explain the events, is it real that the feelings you had when your parents were annoyed or angry didn't tell you anything at all about whether what you did was good enough or not? They didn't, did they? Okay, now take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and then say out loud, nothing I do is good enough. Is it the truth? Does it still feel like the truth? Your answer is very important here. Don't forget that we form beliefs to give meaning to events that have no real meaning. Having done that, we then think we observe the meaning in the events, out there in the world. It becomes a fact for us. Once we realize that the earlier events never had any real meaning, that the meaning was only in our mind, that it was never a fact, that the feeling we had was caused by the meaning we gave meaningless events, the belief disappears forever. Take another deep breath and say, nothing I do is good enough, out loud. I'll bet it feels very different when you say these words now than when you said them at the beginning of this exercise. Do these words feel true, even a little bit? Unless the belief is 100% gone and the words don't feel true at all, you probably still have the belief. Remember, holding a belief is like being pregnant. You either have it or you don't. There's no sort of. If the belief is still there, it probably still seems like you saw it. Once it no longer seems as if you saw nothing I do is good enough in those early events, the belief will be gone. So please click the repeat button to repeat that step of the process. If the belief is gone, please click continue.